Okay, well, welcome back to the second half of the class. Hopefully you guys had a good reading week and the exam wasn't too painful for you. From what I've looked over, they look pretty good so far. We'll try to get those back to you probably by next week. Now, what we're going to do today is look at, specifically this week, we're looking at politics and capitalism and the effect that politics has. And more specifically, we're going to look at the liberal democratic revolutions of basically the 17th century leading all the way up to the late 18th century and the early 19th century. So what we're looking at here again is this idea of liberal democratic revolutions. And I'm going to explain a little bit what that means, what the nature of sort of the bourgeois and the bourgeoisie were in these revolutions and everything. But just for some recap. The first half, of course, was a lot of explaining the origins of capitalism, what capitalism is, the role of merchant capital, why it emerged when it did, how it both spurred and was spurred by imperial expansion, how and why merchants made the jump from trade to production, why this occurs in some places and why not others, and the role of slavery in the emergence of capitalism. We also looked at how capitalism formed distinct classes that were unique to capitalism. Right, the development of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the sort of the middle class merchants who were sort of leading the charge of capitalism, and eventually what would become the proletariat, the workers who by the 19th century would be the sort of industrial working class of England, France, the United States, and other places. We also looked at the logic of capital, how it behaves, how it moves, its sort of intellectual underpinnings going back to Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and all the way up to Adam Smith. And of course, we looked at critiques of capitalism, starting with Marx, but not, of course, limited to Marx. And if you remember, the beginning of this all dated back to changes or sort of changes in the social relations on the English countryside, the emergence of commercial agriculture through the landlord-tenant wage labor nexus, right? From the enclosure movement where land was consolidated in England, which created a sort of dual market for labor and commodities, right? All the peasants had to leave the land. And as a result, there was this sort of landless class of men that had no access to the means of subsistence, so they had no choice but to sell their labor, which created the basis for what would eventually become an industrial working class, but also the basis for a commodity market, because these former peasants, and of course this takes place over generations, no longer had access to the means of subsistence, that is the ability to grow and raise their own food. They had to buy it. Right, which is partly why you got this acceleration of commercial agriculture in the English countryside, setting the conditions for capitalism to eventually enter the realm of production by really the mid to late 18th century. And once they made that jump, right, once merchants made that jump to production, as we saw in the case of Lynn, Massachusetts last year, they cultivated political ties to ensure that the state worked in their interest, which of course brings us to this week's theme. Today, we're going to look more in depth, as I said earlier, about the role of politics in the development of capitalism. Specifically, we're looking to examine the liberal democratic revolutions that took place between the mid-17th century, that is the 1600s, starting with the English Revolution, which eventually leads to a civil war, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and its offshoot, the revolution in Haiti, or the Haitian Revolution. So here, we'll just go to the next slide here. And we'll look at these three revolutions. It just gives you a sense of when they were, right? The English Revolution takes place between about 1640 and 1680. You could also really place the end of it around 1688, which I'll explain a bit more in depth. The American Revolution is from 1775 to, I must have not finished the slide here, from about 1783 is the end of the War of Independence, but you could really date it until 1789, 1790s, when the federal constitution is ratified and George Washington becomes the first president of the United States. And then from there, we'll move to the French Revolution, which in many ways, as we'll see, emerges out of the revolution in the United States, largely because France helped finance and fight the American Revolution, which leaves it in a lot of debt. And of course, when the revolution hits France and people start asking questions about the nature of political representation, what citizenship means, who's counted as a citizen and who is not, who is free and who is not, it's unsurprising then that these ideas find their way to what at the time was France's richest colony, Saint-Domingue, which eventually would become the Republic of Haiti, which I'll explain at the end of the lecture. So we're looking at three revolutions, or 3.5 revolutions, really. Now, each one of these revolutions could constitute an entire lecture, could constitute in some ways an entire course. You could teach an entire course on the French Revolution, and certainly spend a lot of time on those. So we are going to gloss over a lot when we look at these revolutions. And just for those of you that want to do any further reading, a really good book that it's sort of a classic by now. There's a lot more current literature on it to look at is Barrington Moore's The Social Origins of Democracy and Dictatorship and Democracy, rather. It was published in 1966. And a lot of what he's looking at, as it says, is, Lord and Peasant in the Making of the Modern World, why revolutions in some countries led to democracy, or what we call democracy, like in the case of England, the United States, and France, why revolutions in other, or at least the development of capitalism in other countries like, say, Germany or Japan, India, China as well, didn't necessarily lead to what he would call a parliamentary democracy. So it's just something to consider if you want further reading. Now what I'm going to do right now is just go over some common features that all these revolutions have in common, and then we'll also look at some differences. And then from there, I'll probably make a video for each revolution, starting with the English, the American, the French, and then the Haitian Revolution. And depending on how long it goes, I might break them up, but we'll see. Okay, so we'll start by looking at some common features. So as it says here, in each case, a bourgeois revolution is led by a propertied class. Right? Now, it's important to note that even though these revolutions are bourgeois in character, right? Now, bourgeois, of course, becomes the people that eventually form these sort of merchants who make that jump into manufacturing. But it's a little more complicated than that, and I'll explain that in each revolution. That even though these are bourgeois revolutions, in many ways, the people that are leading it, in some cases, especially in the English Revolution, are actually landed wealthy property owners in the countryside in alliance with urban merchant class as well. So they were bourgeois in character, even if they weren't always led by the bourgeoisie. And we'll see how different revolutions, the role of the bourgeoisie is a little different. They're much more prominent in the French Revolution, probably less prominent in the English Revolution, also fairly prominent in the US and the American Revolution as well. So the point is that they were not necessarily led by the groups and individuals who would become part of the bourgeoisie proper, right? That is the emerging class of merchant capitalists. This is key. Even though these are revolutions, they are not what maybe many of us in the 21st century mindset would associate with revolutions or revolutionaries, right? When we think of revolutionary, we tend to think of radicals from the working class, the marginalized of society. And that's certainly true when we get to the late 19th and 20th century, but these revolutions were often led by men of property. And it was almost always men of property, men of means, who were trying to find a greater role for themselves in both government and the state, but also to ensure that the state acted in their interests. So the ones leading these revolutions, as I said, were often well off. They owned property. And in most cases, what they were seeking to do was protect their wealth and property. That's what they were rebelling against, right? In many cases, it was rebelling against a monarchy who wasn't securing what they viewed to be their rights to property and wealth. Now, of course, a revolution is all well and good when you start leading it, but once these ideas emerge, it creates a kind of Pandora's box, and ideas, especially universal ideas about rights and freedom, spread well beyond the people they were necessarily intended to. I mean, one of the most pronounced versions of that, of course, as we'll see later, is in the American Revolution, where the American revolutionaries really in no way intended these ideals to apply to slaves or people of color in general. But of course, once the idea is out of the bag, people interpret these ideas and say, well, now that we're overthrowing governments and we're deciding who gets to be included in the citizenship and who gets to have rights, well, why can't we be included, right? If not you, why not me, so to speak? So this is something that's common to all these revolutions, that there is a sort of what is often referred to as a radical undercurrent provided by a lower sort, whether it's poor farmers or working class people, urban lower sort in the case of the United States, also France, and as we'll see in the case of England, there is also a radical element that aren't necessarily aligned with the interests of the propertied class, even though there is a certain alignment of interest in reforming and possibly even overthrowing the monarchy in each one of these cases. That radical element sometimes pushes the revolution to become much more radical than its original leaders intended, and often those leaders strike back, and these sort of radical movements make progress but are often crushed, as we'll see. Now, in all of these cases, there was a radical undercurrent, as I said, provided by what historians often call the lower sort. Now, some of these people were small property owners. They were, in some cases, the unpropertied working class or unfree laborers, or in the case when we get to Haiti, slaves, right? So what you're seeing is a kind of alignment of class interests that will propel the revolution. And there's always this sort of undercurrent that exists, or this lower sort that exists in all of these revolutions. Yeah. In each case, what you got out of these revolutions, regardless of who ended up being in power at the end of it, was an acceleration of capitalist development, right? You see the commercialization of agriculture, constitutional order, law, and trade and commerce, right? And this is often the result of the securitization of property rights, the seizure of the state by the propertied classes. And in a broader sense, if we go back to a few weeks ago and we talked about liberalism as a secularizing society, and this is a lot of what we mean by a constitutional order. In the case of England, what emerges is a kind of the basis of what will become a constitutional monarchy. In the United States, of course, in a war of independence, you get a republic of what is initially a very sort of aristocratic republic of slaveholders and property owners, and eventually will lead to, by the 1830s, universal suffrage for white men, and by the 1860s, the eradication of slavery. And in the case of France also, it's not just about, initially it was about creating a constitutional monarchy, but then eventually leads to a republic. And I'll get into sort of the kind of spiral of revolution and restoration that happens in the 19th century in France. But in all of these cases, a liberal constitutional order emerges, right? This is a lot of what we were talking about a few weeks ago, with the secularization of society, right? It's no longer about the divine right of kings, but about the rule of law based on these liberal Lockean, Hobbesian, Smithian principles. And because these things became secularized, it also led to this idea of the rule of law is conducive to the acceleration of capitalist development, because it provides standards of commerce, standards of trade, standards of commercialization, all of these things. The emergence of a constitutional order that secures rights for everyone, but especially property rights, is one of these key features that allows trade and commerce to flourish, and especially the intensification of trade and commerce, right? This idea that Locke talked about improvement, right? You always have to be improving your property. It's not based on the divine right of kings and whether you own something simply because God wills it or because the church says it, right? You own it because you will make it better. And this is a lot of these ideas. All right, so there are important differences. Now, the biggest key difference is the extent of social and political change. In some cases, it was less apparently revolutionary. Indeed, in the case of the United States, it was a revolution, but you see a lot more political change than you do social change. It's not to say there isn't social change. There absolutely is social change in the case of the United States, but it doesn't look like that massive social revolution that on the other extreme we see the French Revolution, where it sort of tears the country apart for years and years and years and leads to sort of deep unrest that in many ways never really ends until the late 19th century. In fact, in the United States, historians used to debate whether or not it was a revolution at all. Was it more a war of independence, or was it a revolution? Now, today, the consensus is that it's actually both, and we'll talk more about that later. Now, in the English case, we see what at first seems to be a lot of massive social change, but then ends with, as I said, a kind of conservative constitutional monarchy whereby the king still exists, the rule of law is enshrined under a constitution, the king is sort of subservient to parliament after that. So you do get change, but if you were to look at what English society looked like from a governing point of view and structure, it doesn't look that different than before. What matters is who holds all the power in that balance of forces between the king, the church, and parliament. Now, the other thing that would be different is the nature of the revolutionary coalition. But the nature of the revolutionary coalition often determines the ultimate direction of the revolution, as we'll see. So to what extent urban and landed elites leading the revolution had goals that aligned with the lower sort, right? Were urban and agrarian elites in alignment? And to what extent can we see the effect of this on the revolution. Further, the lower sort, which is often the peasants or the backcountry farmers and the urban crowd, in France they're referred to as the sans-culottes, do they have aligned interests? Just because there's a group of people that are quote unquote called the lower sort doesn't necessarily mean that anybody you could categorize as that has the same interest, right? An urban lower sort may have different interests than a peasantry or backcountry farmers. Just like in sort of the elites leading the revolution, sometimes it's not a complete alignment, as we'll see in the case of France. A lot of the landed elites sided with the crown. In the case of England, a lot of the landowners actually sided with Parliament, and you'll know a lot more about what this means when we get to that in a few minutes. And as we see here again, we have urban elites, agrarian elites, the role of the lower sort, the peasantry, backcountry farmers, sans-culotte, urban crowd. All of these forces are different classes that have different class interests, and the shape of the revolution and the way it ebbs and flows often is the result of the ebbing and flowing of these class alliances, right? When one group of people starts to side with another, that's when the revolution changed, and it's why, especially in the case of France, it becomes incredibly unstable. So unstable that at one point you actually have what's referred to as the Reign of Terror, where 40,000 quote-unquote counter-revolutionaries are executed in the early 1790s. And other key differences are over the fate of slavery. In both the English and American revolutions, it actually affirms slavery. And in the French Revolution, despite their efforts initially to abolish it, they eventually, as we'll see, try to take it back, which leads to, and is part of what we call the Haitian Revolution. So that's sort of an introduction of what we're talking about with liberal democratic revolutions. Again, we're going to look at 3 of them. I'm going to give you some background, sort of the social structure of each individual case, how it leads to revolution. And then after that, I'll go through each individual, sort of not so much the events of the revolution. I'm not going to give you an exhaustive, well, here's what happened in the French Revolution and, For those of you that have taken any Western civilization in high school, be familiar with some of it. If you haven't, that's okay. What's important is to understand the role that these revolutions play in the acceleration of capitalist development and why that happens. And to understand that these really are bourgeois revolutions. These are revolutions led by people of property, people of means in a lot of ways, who just want more access to government and want the state and the government to reflect their interests and wills and desires more so than the old feudal order. Even though in the case of England, feudalism was sort of eroding, there are still these feudal structures that exist. And this is a lot of what these liberal democratic revolutions are about. So I'm going to leave it there for the introduction. And then next I'm going to look at the English Revolution.